Racism is not only a scar on our society, but it is something that is a scourge upon our species, and it holds us back from progression. And anyone who has a good understanding of sociology and cultural anthropology will likely tell you that race is a very arbitrary term that really has no meaning other than that which we give it, much like the borders of the countries we fight so hard to defend from invaders. We use race as a way to divide people. We use race as an excuse to lay action against people and have irrational fears towards certain people. Oberlin Liberal Arts College is one of the most liberal schools in Ohio. It was one of the first schools that started admitting black people and women into its halls, and probably for that reason, lately has been under attack in a series of racist speeches, hate speeches, degrading flyers against black people and gays, acts of vandalism, and most recently, this last Monday, someone was seen walking through the campus with a white hood and robe, dressed as a KKK member. Classes were closed for a day of solidarity to think and reflect on racism and the causes and the possible solutions to this serious problem that is facing our country. Racism is not a dead issue in this country. Unfortunately, there are many people who would even deny the existence of racism in our present culture, but it does exist. It is very real, and it is devastating, and in many ways the denial of that racism is just as dangerous as the racism itself. Ohio, unfortunately, is a very racist state. It is not usually considered the most racist state in the nation, but it does lead the Midwest in the sheer number of white supremacist groups and clubs, including Iranian nations, the KKK, and the National Alliance. At last count, Ohio was home to over 73 white supremacist groups, although the number of white supremacist groups in the country as a whole has risen dramatically since Barack Obama was elected into office. Also, I think it is fair to note that there are less than 73 colleges located in Ohio. So there are more white supremacist groups located in Ohio than institutions of higher learning. Ohio is certainly not alone in its racism. Ohio is but a microcosm of the rest of the country, with bumper stickers that say, "Don't renege in 2012, and bring the white back into the White House on t-shirts at Republican rallies, and people like Rush Limbaugh saying things like, "They're just 12% of the country, who the hell cares?" And we should have segregated buses in this country. This is Obama's America. It's obvious that we still face a deep wound of racism in this country. It is not a scar, it is a fresh wound that is open and bleeding. And though it may be smaller than it has been in the past, it is still prone to infection. Now we have to deal with Avaneen Scalia on the Supreme Court trying to side with Alabama in their protests of the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 5, which imposes upon legislators the burden of proof, which means that they have to prove that new voting laws are not discriminatory towards any particular race before they are allowed to enact those laws. It is very simple. It prevents racism. It is not a racial entitlement, but that is what Scalia is now calling it, an unnecessary racial entitlement. Now what Avaneen Scalia is basically doing to justify his position of eliminating Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is denying the existence of racism in America. He's basically saying that racism is no longer a major factor in this country, and the further implementation of Section 5 is somehow a racial entitlement for minorities. Now, it is very hard for me to believe that racism no longer exists in this country when there are 9 groups, KKK groups in Mississippi alone, 9 in Louisiana, 12 in Iowa, 15 in Tennessee, and Texas leading the numbers with 26 KKK groups. Mississippi is usually considered the most racist state in the Union. They have 10 white nationalist groups, 6 patriot groups, 1 neo-Nazi group, and 1 skinhead group, in addition to their 9 KKK groups within that one state of only 2.9 million people. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act simply puts the burden of proof on the legislators, as I have said. It prevents racism. It is inactive unless it is necessary. There is no reason to take it out unless you're trying to prevent people from getting to the polls. Section 5 is what prevented several states from enacting voting ID laws, which would have made it very difficult for minorities and poor people to get to the polls. It was also one of the reasons that prevented Ohio from eliminating early voting. These are important issues that are obviously still under threat. We need Section 5 in the Voting Rights Act. And the sheer number of extremist groups of these kinds has gone up over 200% since Obama was elected into office. That makes it clear to me that racism is still a major factor in this country and a major problem in this country, including institutionalized racism, which is inherent within our system because of how flawed it has been for so long. Once again, it comes down to education. Know your facts, know your history, know what's happening in the news, understand what these legislators are trying to do and the strategy behind it. It's all linked into racism. It's all linked into a right-wing push for power as well. It's even less about racism and more about keeping as many people down as possible so they have as much room at the top as they possibly can gather. Don't let these people deceive you. Don't let their right-wing propaganda and ideas that racism has come to its end appeal to your sense that you want to believe it. People want to believe it, often because they themselves are racists, and they want to believe, as Scalia thinks he believes, that racism is at its end, so they can say that none of their actions are motivated by racism and everything is just equal now. So, yes, the denial of racism is devastating to the causes that are trying to end racism in this country. By denying the problem exists, you are exacerbating the problem. And that needs to stop, because racism is still a problem. And whether you believe it or not, it's still a disease eating away at our society and keeping us divided and suppressed.